Friends, so far we have discussed the short story as a form that goes by brevity, that goes by directness, that goes by kind of communication which creates a sense of curiosity in the reader. In the second part of the lecture, Professor Payal Nagpal would be requested to tell us about the writing of the short story as a satisfying experience for the writer, and the kind of questions that one has to create in the mind of the reader. Those questions have to be formed first in the mind of the writer, and then those questions can be conveyed to the reader. So in that context, I know Professor Payal Nagpal also has the practice of writing a short story behind the discussion. So I'd like to ask her directly as to what writing of a short story does to the writer and how it satisfies his or her curiosity or purpose.
With my little experience of whatever I have written so far, not published it, is that I think the short story places a demand on the writer, and the demand is of creating a certain picture. And that picture has to that the picture has to appeal both first and foremost to the writer, and the picture that the writer is creating, and to the reader. There has to be something that kind of pushes the writer to move on, in a sense, to this build-up of the scene that is there. And the same pressure has to be there in the story, so that demand that is placed on the writer is also, in a sense, placed on the reader, so that the reader is also interested in reading. I don't want to specifically say what happened next, though of course, with Poe, and when he says that some of the finest tales are tales of ratiocination, we also see that entire detective and speculative writing emerging here. But the idea is also, it does not always have to be what happened next kind of thing, but it has to be something that in which the writer is able to convey a certain mood to the reader. Now, that mood might change at different points in the story, but it has to connect with the larger idea that the writer is trying to convey.
Which for you is a good short story, if at all the goodness can be defined in specific terms?
It's very difficult to do this, but I think if I just something that I begin and I finish it at that very moment, I reach the end of the story. I think that's where, if I put it down and I think that I'm probably going to mull over it and think about it and get back to it, somewhere I think that might just take away from.
Some writers have this problem of starting a short story in one particular way, and in the middle they change their sides and they start saying something different. Is that possible?
That is possible, which is why I was very careful when I said that a certain mood is to be expressed, and this is going to change within a story. It's not as if there is going to be consistency of that mood. So in fact, if there is a consistency, at times that might be boring. So I think that there are certain shifts in a story that the writer presents, and that these shifts move the reader and take the reader through different phases, in a sense.
Is the movement in the short story, moving from one point to another, is it under the control of the author, or it can sometimes go out of the control of the author and then take its own independent direction? Is that possible?
It might seem like a very writerly thing to say, but at times, when one starts with this build-up and one starts writing, it's almost as if at times the words do take the writer away in a different direction. And maybe it is something that the writer is at times conscious of, at times it is probably something that the writer is grappling with subconsciously, and the words do come and probably take the writer in different directions. Not as something mysterious. Obviously there are connections between what the writer is expressively thinking about and writing about, and the subtext that is there in the writer's mind, and what the writer puts down on paper. So I think it is there. This is there. There is a tremendous possibility that what we begin with is not always what we really end with. The characters take you in different directions.
I can think of a situation where the writer decided to create a character who was bold enough to take one's own decisions. And when that happened, then from the writer's hands, the character himself or herself took over and took the story forward. Is that possible?
That is possible. I would say that is possible. That it does happen at times. So, so for instance, in the process of creation of a character, I think this is where the writer's sensibility will also certainly come in. So, for instance, during the pandemic, let's say one is writing a story about the woman in a domestic scenario. Now, how the woman responds to it, despite all her duties, so to say, and all the things that all her household chores, how she manages to get those 5 minutes in this entire scenario is just something it's not as if the character will just independently, independent of the writer, start doing something. But I think this is where the writer's sensibility is reflected in the characters, and there is a kind of synchronic interaction there that leads to probably a moment which the writer might not have envisaged. So,
a question out of the blue. So far as I am concerned, there are men story writers and there are women story writers. You referred to a woman, sharing her own experiences through the short story. Who are better storytellers or better story writers, men or women?
Well, I think this would be a very universalist statement, but I think what a short story by a woman will probably give is that very layered, intense experience, which might not be, I'm not saying necessarily, that is the case, but it might be expressed differently in the case of, a man writing, because today, I mean, we can't look at these two as very binary categories, but certainly one thing is there for sure, that I think a woman writing, it's like movies that are directed by women. So I think they present a sensitivity and a sensibility that is vastly different, I would say, from films that are made by directors who are men. So
wherein lies the difference?
This experience, I think the experience itself of we despite everything, one cannot take away the fact that one is in a patriarchal society, and we look at gender in a certain way. So the experience of being a woman is very different in that sense. So I think what a woman writer brings to the table is this very layered, complex experience.
And there has been a time in human history, till the end of the 19th century, when women were not allowed to speak out, to express themselves, to present their emotions or emotional states in front of the audience. And even if they wrote something, they wrote in the name under the male names, pseudonyms, which means that lots and lots of stories have been happening, in the minds of the women, but they didn't have the opportunity to write, and men wrote.
Yes.
So that's why I asked the question, who are the better storytellers, men or women?
Well, in this case, I think, people who are on the margins, be it women, be it, anybody, I think when we speak from the margins, that's where the real strength and real courage comes from. So this and some of the points that you raised bring us then to this whole idea of, the short story, especially in the context of America, and the short story in the context of the 19th century. And I'd just like to share a few points. One of the things that we discussed, one incident, the singleness, the totality, and so on. And there are a lot of critics who disagree, who would say that the short story frequently deals with more than one incident and does not always produce a single foreseen, a pre-established sort of effect. But a related factor to all this remains that when we look at the 19th century, as Professor Prakash, I think, just rightly pointed out, that women did not have access to a lot of things, and they were still struggling for education, for expression. But increased levels of literacy, I think, greatly helped in creating a reading public that of course contributed in a big way to the evolution and establishment of the novel as a genre, but also a public that also consumed the short story. So the tremendous growth in this sense in terms of numbers in the reading public, the development of periodicals, the journal writings, magazines, all this carried in it the structural space and the germ of writing the short story. So of the short story from a spoken to a written type of literature. We spoke about the oral form, but here we understand that it is in the 19th century that this very major transition is made to the written form, and the great public that was formerly satisfied to have its stories told has become literate and now reads for itself. I think we also need to see and locate as to where the short story really originated. And here Tesha Abraham's introduction, very lucid introduction to the book Women's Writing in the 19th and 20th Centuries is valuable, for she says that the short story was America's contribution to the world. It developed later in Britain. There were several reasons for it, but two of the most important ones included the lack of international copyright in America and the existence of the journal market. So we are talking about a lot of things happening in the 19th century, and of course apart from the fact that we look at the establishment of the rise of the middle class and so on, but very important aspect is in the context of America, because there was no international copyright, so a lot of writing from other countries appeared in pirated form, and which also meant that there was a reading public, and the existence of the journal market also contributed in a big way to this. So the short story which began as a prose tale, it's pointed out by Abraham that in 1800 about 500 tales had appeared in American magazines. And this is very interesting because this tells us about the huge spurt in terms of writing. And the tales were obviously not in finished form the way in which we read the short story today, but the early tales were didactic, and they were like sketches. And this is where we have a very interesting writer. We have Washington Irving, who's considered to be the pioneer of the short story, and he wrote a book called The Sketchbook. And I was directly reminded actually of The Wife of Bath, Chaucer's Wife of Bath, because in the sketchbook there are sketches in a sense of different characters, and one of them is this is from The Voyage, and one can read this, but there is a character which is the character is called the wife, and this wife is very, very, very different from Chaucer's Wife of Bath. And the kind of rebelliousness that we see in The Wife of Bath is not something, of course, that we see here, which also tells us about how bourgeois morality has appeared and has is also kind of controlling women in a certain way. So where Chaucer said that her hose were of a fine scarlet red and full straight and shoes full of moist and new. So here the wife is really speaking more demure and absorbed in a sense within the family. So where the Wife of Bath had husbands 5 at the church, here we see her very dedicated and referred to as the softer sex, and give elevation to character and so on. So we see the way in which a certain kind of morality also controls these early sketches, and these sketches are Reed says that the sketches present certain portraits, and in a sense they are prior to the tales. The tales are the ones that actually tell the story, but it is with Irving's sketchbook that we can really see something very different that's happening, and we see the concretization and the development of the short story here as a genre. So in fact he says in a letter to Henry Brevoort, and this is again from Abraham's introduction, that I consider a story merely as a frame on which to stretch my materials. It is the play of thought and sentiment and language, the weaving of characters, lightly yet expressively delineated, the familiar and faithful exhibition of scenes in common life, and the half-concealed vein of humor that, if often playing through the whole, these are among what I aim at. And here I'd ask Professor
This is what
Prakash.
Washington Irving says?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Which means that he is defining a short story differently from what Edgar Allan Poe would do, and he's calling a story a frame.
Yes.
He's not calling a story an idea or a singleness of purpose. So what he says is that you can put any number of people within the short story, and they can be woven as characters, and then a pattern will emerge. And it's a shorter frame, of course, where it's a short story, but then it can have a lot of variety in it. So
Yes.
that's the difference?
Yes, that is the difference, and of course Irving writes before Poe does. So this is where we actually see the genesis, that, and also you know, in a sense there is a kind of struggle with the form itself. For instance, you know, I think his sense of calling it a frame is also somewhere, I think Irving is creating a structure in his mind into which, you know, the sketch can then be looked at, to create a sketch first and to then look at it as a tale, to see if it is now also telling a story. But you know, Poe of course looks at a totality and singleness of effect, but Irving here, who, as I said, writes before Poe does, is talking about play of thought, sentiment, language, weaving of characters, and exhibition of scenes in common life, and you know, the half-concealed vein of humor. And since we are also discussing, you know, the short story, also, you know, in terms of one's own writing, here, you know, I'd like to ask you, because there are so many characters that, you know, when one is writing a story, these characters emerge. So there are some characters that are there in the forefront, but there are also a lot of characters that make up the scene, so to say. And these characters are also very, very important. And I think in a story, if one part of it is about that singleness, you know, that is to be transmitted to the reader, but the entire scene or the entire sketch or portrait that is there behind it, I think that also carries great value. Who are these characters and who are these people? At times these people could be people, you know, who might appear extraneous in a sense to the main course of events, but very important in society otherwise, and rather ignored for that reason.
The model for the short story writer is the you know, entirety of the society in which one lives, and therefore one has to see a large number of characters struggling to emerge out of that general malaise, out of that general condition. So the writer focuses upon those who are coming up or who are going down, depending on one's vision, that it's a tragic vision or a comic vision, a positive vision or a negative vision, and that both visions are important to consider in the context of a writer. Actually, I was struck by this particular thing that you talked about, American short story, or the short story that was written in America, and that it struck its roots there before it might have happened in the other parts of the world. So what is American about the American short story, if one can?
Yes, yes. In fact, there's a and here, as I said, that I'm, you know, looking at the argument that is presented by Abraham, that, for instance, if one looks at the Civil War in America, so writers who've written during that period have written very differently from writers who've written after the Civil War. And then again, when we look at writers of color, especially women, how is it that they use the form of the short story to express their own context? That again presents a very, very different, you know, worldview to us. And the short story then becomes a genre that is taken up by these writers, by writers like, you know, people of color. It could be, you know, an important historical, political event like the Civil War. So, you know, there is a major difference in that sense, especially in the context of America, as we're talking about this, in terms of these writers. So, but when we say it's American, it's primarily, you know, in terms of the two factors that have already been discussed. But it is through these sketches, in a sense, which is where I was greatly struck by the general prologue and the connection with something like Irving's sketchbook, that presenting certain pictures and portraits, and gradually from there moving on to characters telling these stories, and moving on in a sense from the sketch to the tale. And how then in the 19th century itself, women writers, we know that the novel develops and evolves in the hands of women writers who write under pseudonyms, and the same thing continues also in the case of the short story, where the women are, be it the American women, the English women, they're all writing. Kate Chopin, and we have Charlotte Perkins Gilman, and so many writers who, in whose hands the short story is going to be very different. So there is, I think, the context, given the genre, the historical context, the context of where it is written from, I think that the location then becomes important.
The clashes of the blacks and whites,
yes,
the Civil War, the South and North in America, they're struggling, to emerge victorious.
Yes.
And the difference of opinion occurs at every level, and there is social oppression, and people are not happy in that oppressive state. Therefore, they express themselves this way or that way. So that
Absolutely.
becomes the stuff of the short story in America.
Yes.
I see. And
it is something that is reflected in a sense in the short story.
And all the writers of the novels also write short stories in America. Hawthorne writes short stories.
Hawthorne writes short stories. Yes.
Mark Twain writes short stories.
Yes.
And Washington Irving, as you say. And what is the difference between the sketch and the short story?
So this is a difference that's actually pointed out by Ian Reid, that when we look at the sketch is almost like a portrait that is presented, but in that sense it's the pre-tale phase, but the tale is the one that's telling the story, and from the tale I think it's much later that the word story is used. So I think the transition from tale to story would also be a transition about the making of the genre itself.
And the connection between the sketch and the story, what is the connection?
The connection remains. I think this presenting a picture, and for instance in this particular sketchbook by Irving, it is not only a sketch of the wife, it tells a story. But the idea is to present a certain model in a sense of the wife. So it's didactic in that sense. But that the entire the glimpse, the portrait of that moment that is presented. It could be the characters, where they are located, their house, the city, the countryside. So all these aspects, I think these are like sketches in the mind of the writer telling different stories. There is I think a tremendous visual quality in a short story. And I think that tremendous visual quality of a short story comes from this connect with a sketch.
Visual quality.
Yes.
Which means pictures, which means the certain states of mind which are telling in nature.
Which are telling in nature, which emerge probably of course in the mind of the writer, but as a reader of the short story too, I would say that, I mean, if we talk about the Yellow Wallpaper, or we talk about Chopin's short stories, one can see, one can visualize these in a certain way. There is this tremendous quality of visualization.
So take this metaphor back to Chaucer, who starts with sketches of those 30 travelers, and then they each are supposed to tell the story. The book didn't finish, but the stories continued, and more would have been written. So would you say that all the 30 characters in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, who are introduced in the form of the sketch, they are carrying in them their own stories?
Yes, certainly, which was the reason that I actually spoke about Chaucer, because I could see that if in the 19th century we are looking at something like the sketchbook as an early carrying in it the early form of the short story, then I think we actually also we need to look at Chaucer, though of course we look at it in terms of not short story, the genre of the short story, but I think in terms of, because it was not available, but I think in terms of the way in which Chaucer has painted what is very often said of him, the picture gallery, the portrait gallery, and each character, each painting that he has presented before the reader is telling a story, which is why the general prologue is followed by these tales. So yes, certainly look at it in
Is
that
the
way.
sketch also a story? Or the sketch is of the person and that person then becomes crystallized in one short story?
In Irving's case, he calls it a sketchbook, but they are also telling stories.
There is stories,
Yes,
okay.
yes. So for instance, the story of the wife, there is a story that is there.
Hmm.
But probably what is more important than the story itself is, I think, the sketch of the wife that is created, through that story. So in that sense, I think Irving is still, toying with this whole idea of creating sketches, be it the voyage. There are different characters and different sketches. So there is something called the voyage, and then there is the wife, and many such that follow. So again, in England too, the short story is influenced by various movements at that point of time, and for one can look at the connection with the periodicals, and we can look at stories written by writers like Stevenson and so on. So there is a connection in that sense, not only with the short story and the context, but I think any piece of writing would carry with it, a certain relationship, in a sense, with the context in which, it is interacting, and where it emerges.
In 3 or 4 sentences, can the argument be summed up for the benefit of the students?
Yes, I think what we have presented here today is the debate around the short story. So we look at its genesis. Of course, we look at the oral tradition, we look at Chaucer and the general prologue, but as a genre, it concretizes, it emerges in written form in the 19th century. And we look at it in the context of a writer like Washington Irving, and evaluate the transition from sketches to sketches telling stories, to what Edgar Allan Poe says and calls the short story a prose tale. So the debate that we have in front of us, to which I think Poe's piece on review of Hawthorne's Twice Told Tales, about the singleness of effect that is there. And I think when we look at writing today, I think we just need to look at what Nadine Godimer says on this. She says that the short story is a fragmented, restless form, and it is for this reason it suits the modern consciousness. So I think from singleness of effect, we've moved, many decades ahead and eons ahead, to look at it as a fragmented, restless form, which also allows us to look at the short story as something still in the making.
So friends, the topic of the short story, a kind of argument about it, a kind of point about it, has been very properly, presented by Professor Payal Nagpal, and the points she has raised are all open-ended. He is open to conviction, and you can have your own view of it, as Professor Payal Nagpal has, and I think it will inspire you to think further about the nature of the short story that all of us read and like to read. Thank you.